I kept doing cocaine so that I wouldn't black out on champagne. I still woke up on the subway at 5 a.m. to the sound of Celia pounding her fists against the door's window. It took me a second to realize that we were inside the subway, not out on the platform. As soon as I moved an inch, Celia whipped around to face me and yelled, "We both passed out! We must have passed out after like 3 stops!" I stumbled from one railing to another to stand beside her. I squinted through the dirty window and saw the station sign, Coney Island, Stillwell Avenue, the end of the line. That train was decommissioned for the night and its doors were impossible to pry open. I banged my fists against the windows. Both of us yelled, "We're screaming in there!" Some maintenance guy power washed the platform. His hose blasted so loud against the tiles that he couldn't hear us. When he finally looked up to see 2 women nearly breaking down the door, we startled him so bad I thought he'd fall onto the 3rd rail. When the doors finally slid open, I was too disoriented to just walk across the platform and get into the subway going back to Manhattan. I couldn't even think to say no when I saw Celia strolling past the red exit sign. She yelled, "Come on," over her shoulder. She stopped to turn to me and said, "I haven't been to Coney in years." Daylight was just barely creeping over the Atlantic. We'd been at Anton Gretsch's New Year's Eve party in the Upper East Side. It was kind of a big annual art world thing, the kind of party I wouldn't be invited to if I wasn't Anton's assistant at MoMA. He was the curator of the film and media department then, and I'd been the assistant curator for about a year, since right before MoMA closed for renovations again. God, that was a mess. Closed for 2 years, so we had to set up shop in Queens at a satellite building. I barely started the job before they gutted the place. I did get to go to these she parties that I usually needed Celia to bring me to, though. No, she didn't even want to go to the party. Yeah, just because of Anton's association with MoMA. She took that 20-year-old band from the museum strangely seriously. Like the museum's ticket attendants had a picture of her behind their desks or something. And if she ever showed up, the museum might never show her work. She really wanted something in MoMA. It still hadn't happened. Not one piece. This is after she had her video installations acquired by the Whitney, the Tate Modern, Centre Pompidou, the Walker in Minneapolis, a few things at Ostrov Fearnley in Oslo. Well, you know, still, nothing at MoMA. She didn't have anything at the Met either, but they didn't acquire a single video work until 2001. She wasn't waiting on the Met, but she wanted something in MoMA. She wanted the same permanence of Picasso, Degas, Matisse, Pollock, Van Gogh, basically all of the men. Sure, some of those other museums might have had a Van Gogh or a Rousseau, but it wasn't Starry Night or Sleeping Gypsy. She hadn't even had anything included at a group show at MoMA. Maybe she had a point about that band. When we talked about going to the party, I thought she might have gotten really serious at 38. Maybe too serious. Because she kept saying, "I really shouldn't go without my own invitation." "Celia, look through your email. You probably got an invitation." It probably helped to tell her what Anton told me. A couple days before the party, I was led around the museum's renovations in progress with Anton. We were escorted in hard hats like it might all collapse at any moment. And Anton's all jazzed up showing me where the Merode Gallery was being built. It'd be the first time in 75 years that MoMA actually dedicated space to moving image works. I looked around the space and it's supposed to be 1,600 square feet, but I'm looking around and it dawned on me that 1,600 square feet was barely bigger than my parents' apartment. The ceilings aren't even very tall in that part of the building. I said we'd never be able to show either of Celia's monumental works, the apartment building or Boxers. And they obviously sounded super bummed out, and so, well, I guess it's just as well she was banned from ever coming back. Anton looked at me through his round black-framed glasses. He said, "Bond?" in that indecipherable accent he has from living all over the world. He hadn't even heard of Celia walking through this place naked. I thought everyone knew that story. But, yeah, I guess that's not what anyone talks about anymore. There weren't any pictures of it happening, so I guess it never happened. I tell all this to Anton, how I saw Celia's bare ass walking in front of me before the security guard threw the blanket over her. And he says to me with this giant grin, "No, no, no, dear. The MoMA does not ban nude women." At the party, after Anton got a little more American drunk than I'd ever seen him, he teased Celia for thinking she was still Bond. Bond, Bond. It is so funny. But really, why else wouldn't they have acquired something by then? It's not like Patrick never tried lining it up for her. Celia downed a shot of real absinthe and laughed with Anton. They'd known each other from meeting at all the art biennials. Anton said, "How can you bond Celia Merode?" And she answered, "No, really, I was Bond. I was there. The security guards picked me up and threw me out the back door. Bond." Other curators were laughing. I don't know if Anton noticed how she said Bond instead of banned. A curator from the Whitney said, "I don't think she can really be banned. It's not like Tony Shafrazi never went back after he spray painted some bullshit across Guernica." An artist said, "Or when Banksy hung his own work without telling anyone." And somebody else said, "Or when Harvey Stromberg pasted in his trompe-l'oeil photographs." Celia stopped them and said, "I think you're all missing the common theme here." But she didn't specify with anything more than a knowing look at them all the men themselves. At least one of the curators groaned for everyone to hear. But when we all looked at him, he didn't have the balls to say what he moaned about. He said what? Like he hadn't just made a big stupid scene of himself. Anton tried breaking the tension by saying to Celia, "Bond or no, I wish I had been there." And he looked at her all dreamily. And that just made everything worse because everyone saw him taking her clothes off with his eyes. I think she was about to slug him, but then somebody brought over the ancient curator from paintings and shouted, "We have a primary source!" The old man was obviously nervous around Celia. He had to be dragged up to us, but even though he was a cowardly little rabbit, he still managed to say, "Well, yes, I remember the day that she was kicked out. We all forgot about her pretty quickly, but we all talked about her again when she became TV famous." Yeah, he called her TV famous for that piece that she did that made all those religious kooks go after her in the early 90s. An important piece! And he reduced her to something dumb you'd watch on television. And then it got a little fuzzy for me. The last thing I remember before I completely blacked out was me and Anton sitting on a couch alone in some room that I never even noticed when I was sober. I kinda came to for a moment and realized I sat right next to him, knee to knee, leg to leg, hip to hip, and I was blathering on, saying something like, "Well, the Walker in Minneapolis is buying boxers." I don't know if I meant to lie, but I was in the middle of saying that. It wasn't a total lie. I'd heard it. From people. Okay. Maybe I hadn't heard it from anyone who actually knew. But, okay. I probably just made that up to pique his interest. Or because I was completely out of my mind at that point. And then I realized he had his hand on my leg. I looked around the room and nobody else was in there. I heard people somewhere else in the apartment, but I couldn't see anyone else. And I didn't know where Celia was. So I just kept talking, saying how Anton must buy one of Celia's major pieces. The boxing work should be the defining piece of the new millennium. Why were we letting some museum in Minneapolis buy it? He said something about not having enough space to show such a giant piece. The museum's director would never approve spending so much money on something that can rarely be shown on site. He wrapped an arm around my shoulder and I shouted, "Let's show it at PS1!" We were in the middle of merging with the museum in Queens. It would be a perfect place for us to show Celia's greatest work on a permanent basis. He squeezed me closer and said something about how PS1 was only meant for temporary works. His breath reeked of juniper and olives. It stunned me into a tiny bit of sobriety. I eased away from him, but I didn't have any farther to go than the couch's armrest. So I jolted up onto my feet, stood in front of him, grabbed him by the knees, and looked directly into his eyes. I said, "You need to try." Then I strutted out of there like I just nailed some boardroom presentation. That's how I remember it anyway. Maybe I just stumbled out of there with toilet paper on my heel, because the next thing I definitely remember happening was Celia banging her fists against the subway's door at 5 a.m. By the time we walked down the metal stairs onto the Coney Island streets, I was far beyond assured that she hadn't become too serious. The sky got lighter, the street was completely empty, the gates at Nathan's Hot Dogs were pulled down, and the carnival games have been shut off since early autumn. The only sound I heard was the Atlantic hitting the shore. So Celia said, "Let's go to the water." We stood on the wooden boardwalk overlooking the beach and the ocean. And we saw flames. Fire swirled in the air over the beach. I needed to sit down on a bench, but Celia yelled, "Come on!" I don't know how Celia walked so fast through that sand. My feet were dragging, and it was cold, probably only in the 40s or 50s, and we did not have jackets. But Celia was dead set on getting to these flames. I was still foggy as hell. That red glow could have been some carnival ride for all I knew. But when we got closer, I realized that people actually swung those flames around and around. The only people we'd seen since leaving the subway platform. 12 or 24 men and women were gathered on the beach, and they watched a man spin balls of fire on a pair of chains, whipping them around so fast that the circles closed in vibrating red loops. And then he slowly dropped the flames into his mouth, one at a time, each of them going out behind his lips. I turned to his left and just then realized that a woman was pulling a 2-foot-long sword out of her mouth, slowly. And I heard people clapping, and I think I clapped. And then a man hammered a nail into his left ear. He hammered a nail into his right ear, and the sun kept rising, and the ocean would not stop thumping against the beach. A few hours later, I woke up on a couch in an apartment with walls decorated and posters for the Coney Island Freak Show. I heard the woman who'd pulled a sword from her throat. She was washing dishes in the kitchen. Her sword sat in the dish rack. Celia walked out of the bathroom and said it was time for the polar bear plunge. We were apparently running late. I was whisked out the door and back to the beach, crowded between hundreds of people shivering in bathing suits, everyone smiling through chattering teeth. And the woman with the sword, but now without the sword, she pulled me by my left hand. Celia pulled me by my right hand. They dragged me between them like I was their kid. And Celia yelled for me to strip. "It doesn't count if you have clothes on." I lost my pants on the beach while 500 people screamed into the Atlantic, screaming into New Year's Day. And then everyone splashed their feet into the frigid ocean and gasped at the exact same time. A wave broke against my chest. It slid away from me, ripping the oxygen out of my lungs. My entire body wanted to collapse, but the water was so cold that I couldn't fall. I stood frozen like a stiff Giacometti. I trudged back onto the beach, basically hyperventilating, slogging all over the place trying to find my clothes. They were covered in sand. I dug through my pants and pulled out my phone to see what time it was. Anton had texted. Twice. I didn't want to read them. I had to read them. He wrote, "So sorry about last night. Too much to drink." I really wished I knew for sure what he was apologizing for. But then 10 minutes later, maybe freaking out because I hadn't responded yet, he wrote, "Boxers is a perfect idea." He'd start campaigning for the director's permission to acquire it immediately. I looked out at the ocean, and Celia was still out there, doing a backstroke like she was between daiquiris in the Bahamas. The acquisition meeting was far different than usual, primarily because Anton needed to set up all of the potential works in Queens rather than the 53rd Street building, which was still under renovation. I heard a lot of grumbling from our members about needing to be schlepped out to Long Island. Some of them referred to it as Long Island, as if we needed to convene in Montauk and not just across the East River. I swear the Turkish mining CEO actually inquired whether the building had a helipad. I think he was serious. So you'd like to know how the museum actually acquires its art? Well, it begins with the curator. Anton develops relationships with artists. He must judge where the artist stands in art history. Is the artist creating works that need to be preserved for posterity? Beauty and craft are not terribly important. Anton must judge whether the piece is important to the history of art, and sometimes to the country's larger history. Once the museum acquires a piece, once any museum acquires a piece, it usually won't be deaccessioned. That is, unless somebody learns that the Nazis had looted it. So Anton becomes an artwork's biggest fan. He must convince the director that the piece belongs in the museum's permanent collection. And this isn't merely about history. What is the work's condition? Is it an authentic piece? What is its provenance? How does it relate to the rest of the collection? Does it fill any gaps in the collection? Does it lead the collection down any future paths that must be considered? And then less important to the museum goer, but of great relevance to the director, how much will it cost to exhibit and store the piece? How much will its long-term maintenance cost? When exhibited, will this be a piece that draws larger audiences, therefore justifying a larger price tag? Based on art world gossip, that last point finally made the director believe Anton should acquire Merode's boxers. And at this point, with the director's blessing, Anton must convince the 12 of us on the Film and Media Committee to vote in favor of acquiring the work. When we met in early 2004 at the Queens building for our quarterly meeting, we had the added pressure of acquiring works suited for our first permanent space, the Marita Gallery. Anton was very concerned about making a very big splash with this space. He was one of the primary forces behind it. He was most excited for Merode's boxing piece. Anton gesticulates when he is very excited about a piece. Now, he can tell us so many things about a work, the artist's story, its provenance, but we only know that he is truly interested in a piece when his arms are flapping about like a wounded flamingo. Not that this was necessary. Some of us saw the piece when it debuted at Art Basel years before, and that familiarity didn't take away any of its awe. When I wasn't dumbstruck by this interactive installation, I snuck glances at my fellow committee members, observing their own awe-struck mouths agape, and I was delighted to realize that yes, we were in the presence of magic, and my predilections had been confirmed. As we viewed it a second and third time, Anton scrambled around, belligerently yelling about something he hadn't noticed on screen before. "It's still new," he yelled. "It's still now. It will always be now." So it was then up to our committee to vote on it. There was the chairman of the board of a Turkish mining company, a private equity investor, the CEO of a biomedical company, an executive for an insurance company, the heir to a shopping mall magnate's fortune, a Hollywood actress whom we all bragged about knowing, the chairman of a brokerage firm, 2 major Hollywood producers, a Hollywood agent who was an executive at CAA, a travel technology entrepreneur, a software publisher, and a few heiresses, including myself. My family made its fortune selling hamburgers at a chain restaurant that you've probably had the displeasure of visiting in the past year. I don't talk about that part of my life so often. Like the other heiresses, I prefer the job title of philanthropist. Not surprisingly, there were no artists among our ranks. No, and no curators either. All of us had been given our positions after we generously donated works or finances to the museum. You might believe that this is undemocratic, but darling, we spend so much more time than the few seconds that the average museum goer spends in front of a painting. Anton did not like us to immediately vote after seeing the works, so he gave us folders with information on everything he'd shown us that morning. Though I don't think that any of us would remember anything aside from Merode's piece. He then said that he'd begin accepting anonymous votes in 24 hours, and he sent us on our way, via helicopter or mere chauffeured car. I was surprised when Bruce Gribaldi called. We come from such different worlds. He's such a well-known film producer, and, well, I suppose my name is well-known too. It's on the software, of course. But when people think about Wild, they don't really think about my bald head, which is good. It is. We want people to think about learning a new language when they think of Wild. Not male pattern baldness. Still, I never talked to Bruce outside of our quarterly meetings. He didn't usually attend the museum's galas. I'm sure he had somewhere even more exclusive to attend. You know, exclusive to the beautiful people. I already had my ballot filled out for Anton. I was very excited about Merode's piece. It was right on the bleeding edge. There was some risk in acquiring it, I suppose, but even if it did take up the department's entire budget for the year, I still stood by it as a very important acquisition. Except I got that curious call from Bruce. I immediately made what my son calls a dad joke and told Bruce, "I've been waiting forever for you to ask me to be in a movie. What'll it be? I think I'd be a great action star." Bruce didn't seem to realize I was joking because there was a long pause on his end. Before that went on any longer, I blurted, "Kidding, just kidding, what can I do for you?" He mumbled to himself, I guess realizing that I was joking, and he started laughing, and it was quiet at first, almost like a tee-hee, but then he started in with these big barreling ha's, like, ha, ha, ha! That seemed, I don't know, unnatural. Nobody laughs at my jokes like that. Even I know they aren't that funny. But we get to talking about our latest meeting and the potential acquisitions, and he says, "I want to get your opinion on something. More than anyone else on this committee, I respect your opinion. I think you have substantial authority on these media works. Guys like me know a lot about film, but I can't tell the difference between a Pike and a Nauman." I didn't think this was exactly true, but it was nice to have somebody compliment my taste. I can never really tell what Anton thinks of our opinions. He asked, "What do you think of this Merode piece?" I told him I loved it. I assumed everyone agreed. But he said, "I'm just concerned, I guess." Concerned? He said, "I'm sure you've heard she's working on something even bigger, greater, more technologically advanced." It was no secret that she worked on an even bigger piece. She talked about it in the press, and she obviously considered it her magnum opus. But no images had been seen. There were only the awestruck descriptions from people she worked with. I asked him why he thought this was concerning. He said, "Well, I'm just concerned that this newer piece will just be so much better. And we obviously aren't acquiring two of these things given the department's budget, and nobody has bought this one yet. Or the first one even. So I don't think we have anything to lose in holding off to see what she does next." I wasn't so sure. Then he said, "And I know you're the sort of guy who doesn't want to spend piles of money on something that's already obsolete compared to the next model." I said, "I don't think boxers will ever be obsolete. It's why we're acquiring it." He said, "You know what I mean. Obsolete might not be the right language. I'm just trying to speak to your background." I asked him, "Don't you love the work?" He said he did, more than anything. But that's actually what made him worried. He loved this piece so much, but from what he'd heard, the next thing was just going to blow it out of the water. So he was concerned that if we put all of the department's budget into this piece, it would stop us from making the much more obvious choice with the new work. I could understand that. He said, "I really think you and I should get everyone to say no now, so that we can say yes when it really counts." When it really counts. When it really counts. I asked him when this new work was supposed to be finished, and he said very soon. We could buy it within a year. And if not, he was sure that we could still just buy boxers because it wasn't going anywhere. No, I wasn't expecting a phone call from Bruce. He never seemed to like anyone on the committee. I always had the feeling he felt it was beneath him. He had an air about him, like his painting should still be shown at the MoMA, like they were better than everything we voted on. It had been decades since the man painted. Or at least was known for painting. You'd think that the man would be happy after achieving so much success producing films. But I took the call a little apprehensively, mind you. Because I don't want the other members to sway me one way or another in the week after our meeting. I take our duties very seriously. I don't want my friendships in the art world to guide my votes. One of my first philanthropic endeavors was for a dear friend's equestrian clinic when we attended gymnasium. She was my friend, but she didn't know what she was doing. For every horse that died in that project, I had to spend a year pulling my name out of the muck. So since then, I've only given to the very best. I picked up the phone and Bruce immediately said, "I'm in a bind." "A bind?" I said. "Oh, really?" He said he wanted to buy boxers. This sounded like a conflict of interest. He said he didn't want to buy it for himself, but supposedly for the museum. I told him the museum was already buying it. At least I assume so. We both saw how excited everyone was after the showing. He said, I know, but I want to build a permanent space for it. If the MoMA buys it on its own, it'll rarely be shown. If I build the space for it, it'll always be shown. I asked him why he didn't just build the space. He goes on and on about how there's too much risk. He wants to make sure he can show the work on a continuous basis. And the museum might not, even if he builds a space for it. I said it sounded like he just wanted his name on a building associated with the MoMA. He admitted, you got me there, but tell me this. Wouldn't it be worth it if it meant we could free up the department's budget to buy more works? If we ask MoMA to pay for boxes out of its own pocket, our department won't be able to buy anything else for another year. Maybe longer. So forget about my name on a building. This is about saving the museum money. It is about spreading the success to more artists. I suppose he had a point. I didn't even want to do the math on how many pieces we could buy in place of Celia's. Bruce said, dozens. I was admittedly intrigued. So I asked, how many dozen? Of course I wanted to be in one of Bruce's films. For a long time. The artistic integrity. I mean, he had the voting academy wrapped around his finger. So I was excited when he arranged a phone call. I wasn't getting any of those kinds of roles. And I mean, those roles didn't even really exist when I don't want to say in my heyday in the 90s. I don't want to sound ancient, but I was definitely much more focused on the blockbuster then. My agent kept trying to convince me that audiences wouldn't accept me as anything but a paramour in romantic comedies. So, speaking of roles that don't exist, I didn't need to read between the lines to know that I wouldn't even be offered those roles after turning 40. I had to tell my agent to never again send me a grandmother role, or else I'd drop him for somebody else. Can you believe that somebody thought that I should read for a grandmother? I mean, look at these legs. So I was more than a little surprised that Bruce not only wanted to talk to me, but that he'd guarantee me a role in one of his company's upcoming movies. He could change audiences' perceptions of me with just one good role, even a small one, a cameo even. People trusted him to make great art. I think that came from his early years as a very successful painter. Yes, there was a time in the 80s when we'd be at the same parties in New York, and he'd be more famous than me. He sold it as a good deal for both of us. He obviously knew that I didn't normally get roles in his sorts of movies, but I also knew that his company barely paid better than scale, and not the rates that I usually earned. All I needed to do, which was strange. I immediately knew it was strange, even for this industry. But all I needed to do was vote no on acquiring the Celia Merode. I didn't feel good about it exactly, but I wasn't asking any questions either. It was odd. He knew that I coveted the Cindy Sherman that he owned. Pieces from that series were nearly impossible to find. They never went on the market. But he agreed to sell it to me if I voted no on the Merode piece. He was adamant about how Merode's work was too inconsistent, like different mediums, and she wasn't particularly good at any of them. He said that she hadn't found her voice yet. I think he was thinking about his own experience, how his paintings were panned after everybody thought he was so great. I would have made the connection for him, but I didn't want to offend the guy. He said Boxers was a vanity project, worse than Hedy Lamar's Love of Three Queens. I didn't get that reference, but he was very passionate about it. I believed him. I did vote for it, but apparently I was in the minority. Oh, yes. Many of them tried to lie and say that they had voted for it. But the truth came out before long. Everyone, of course, expressed shock when we voted down the Merode. But I did some snooping. First, I called Bruce because he told me he was buying it. I wanted to know how quickly he was making the purchase. But all of the sudden, Mr. Hollywood was too busy to take my calls. So I contacted our fellow members. There are some men on the committee who are so narrow-minded, even in the 21st century, that I didn't bother talking to them. I knew they voted no. I asked the members who seemed just as excited as me after the private exhibition in Queens, and they told me that they didn't see the harm in voting no. They thought that the piece would obviously be acquired with or without their vote. But why, I asked, why take such a silly risk if it's what you loved? I already had my suspicions. I'd received that phone call. And pretty soon we had a dozen different stories being spun by one man. He didn't attend our next quarterly meeting, but some of us wanted to confront him. He'd done a very bad thing. At the meeting after that, half a year later, he did show up. But it felt as if I was the only person left who was still upset about this. I asked the other philanthropists if they'd confront him with me, but they either seemed too afraid to say anything or they just brushed it aside. Water under the bridge. Of course, all of the men on the committee couldn't have cared less. They were all happy that Mr. Hollywood could attend the meeting again. They didn't even seem to question why he skipped the previous one, that he might have actually felt a pinprick of guilt or shame somewhere past that thick tuft of chest hair always sneaking over his collar. I was exasperated, but felt completely powerless to do anything. And to this day, the museum does not have a Merode in its permanent collection.